Oh, no. Okay. So thanks to everyone for joining us today. My name is Satya Raman. I'm with the Ecology Action Center, and in partnership with Nourish, we've been involved in the early phases of the development of the Grow, Eat, Learn program. And I'm on, as Kayla has here on the slide deck, I'm helping to do some tech support today. So I just wanted to give a few little updates on using Zoom for the webinar, and then I'll turn it over to Kayla and Marjorie for the content. So we are recording this, which means hopefully this will be able to post it on the website and share it with others. We have a chat function at the bottom of your screen. We don't have the mic for participants or video for participants enabled, but if you are having a chat, like a technical difficulty, please use the chat and I'll monitor it throughout the webinar. We won't have a lot of time for questions, but if a question does come up for you, please use the Q&A function also along the bottom of your screen. I'll be monitoring that, and we'll try and answer any questions in the time frame we have. And if we don't get to them today, we will get a response out to everyone by email to all participants. And I think that's pretty much it for the tech side of things. Kayla, if there's a moment, I'll monitor as we have more attendees, and if there's a natural break, I may repeat some of these instructions for people as they come, but for now, I think we'll just get going.
Absolutely, that sounds great. So thanks everyone for joining us today. Before we show our faces, I'm just going to give a quick overview of the webinar. So we're really lucky today to have Marjorie Willison joining us to share her knowledge and expertise around closing a garden for the season. So if you're involved in a school food garden, you may have been planning your harvest and wrap up. So really timely topic to be discussing today. And then we're going to finish the webinar with an introduction to Grow, Eat, Learn and the guiding practices, which we're really excited to have launched last week, all to support school food gardens around the province. So we would like to get to know some of the participants here. So I believe, Satya, you can post the poll questions now if that works. There's just a few questions here around what regional center for education or school board you may be a part of. If you're not a staff of any of these, and maybe one in your region or one that you support, welcome to put a submission for that. Also a question about how many years you've been involved in a garden. This doesn't have to just be a school food garden. It can be a garden at home or in your community. And also if you're part of our Nova Scotia School Food Garden Network on Facebook, which we can tell you a little bit more about later. So take a second here and respond to those three questions so we can get to know who's listening in today.
Okay, we have a few coming in. So we don't have, there's still more coming in, but we have folks from Annapolis Valley, Chignecto Central, and Tri-County. And people have been involved in, 2/3 of the folks have been involved in gardens for 1 to 5 years, and one person's been in over 10 years, so a long time. And no one's currently part of the Grow, Eat, Learn Facebook page. So that's a really good thing for perhaps people to check out, and we can post the link afterwards. I'm going to just leave the poll active for a little bit, so as other participants join, if they want to see the poll when they come, and I'll end it in a few minutes just in case we capture anyone else.
That's great. Okay. All right, so hopefully you can see our faces now. I'm Kayla Thomas. I work for Nourish Nova Scotia as the Program Development Coordinator, and I'm a dietitian here within the organization. And I'm joined by a familiar face and definitely a familiar voice, Marjorie Willison, who you may know as the local garden expert on Maritime Noon. So you hear her friendly voice quite often. But Marjorie's here to share her knowledge and experience in school food gardens. So we have a number of questions for her, and as Satya mentioned, there is a chat box for your questions that we will at the very least address after the webinar if we don't have time for them today. So welcome, Marjorie.
Well, thank you. I'm really pleased to be here.
Thanks. So we'll jump right into some of the questions, Marjorie. Can you tell us just a little bit about how you came to be a gardener, or a gardener expert, as we refer to you as, when you started, and how you've learned over time?
Well, I think probably the most important thing for me to move towards becoming a gardener was seeing my own parents gardening. So growing up in the 1950s and 60s, my parents and those of my friends, just, having a home and a family meant you grew some food. So I knew that you had to dig into the ground to get the potatoes. And I knew that the tomatoes grew on a plant. And I also learned that tomatoes were related to potatoes. So it was just like little tiny bits of information that kept coming to me. And so when we had, when I got all grown up and had a husband and a house and a garden and kids, I of course wanted to have a garden, but I didn't necessarily absorb everything my parents taught me, but I read books from the library. Like, our library system is really great. You can get lots of books there. And I tried things out, and some things worked and some things didn't work. But it didn't matter, because we learn from our mistakes. And I think that's a really important message to get across to children, that it's okay to experiment. You might not be certain that something's going to work, but it's really worth trying it out. And if it works, that's wonderful. And if it doesn't work, well, you see, well, now what did I learn? Mm-hmm. So just doing that. And of course, once I knew better, I could do better. And I am still learning.
Lifelong learning in the garden, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. Absolutely.
Great. So like I mentioned, many school food gardens are starting to wrap up their growing season now that their students are back. They may be planning harvest events and thinking about shutting down their garden. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the steps or recommendations to close down a garden for the season, and how maybe students could be involved?
Certainly. So I think it's important to keep harvesting as long as you can. Things like Brussels sprouts and beets and carrots and Swiss chard, they can all tolerate frost, a certain amount of frost. Tomatoes, no, you better cover them up. Zucchini, you better cover them up if a frost threatens. So that's why I think it's important to pay attention to what the weather forecast is, and if a frost warning is out. And then you just take old sheets or old bedspreads and spread them over top of the plants in the garden that would be affected by frost. And, you might have to do that 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 times. And then there comes a point where you think, no, this is really the end of the growing season. So I think it's important to focus on removing diseased plant material. So that's an opportunity to show children any plant material that's diseased. So you want to get that out of the garden. Any insect damaged material, because it may be that the insects are the kind that overwinter in the soil, or they could be insects that fly in on summer storms. But if you're not sure, you might as well get those plants out of the garden. But I think it's important to leave other plants in the garden to cover the soil, so that winter rains don't cause any erosion, because you don't want to lose any of your precious soil. And I have made that mistake, and I will never do it again. But you can also do what's called, if you get to school in the first week in September, there are still things that you can plant, like short beets or short carrots, more lettuces, things like Chinese cabbage or spinach or Swiss chard. And people don't think about planting in the fall, but you can. And don't be too concerned about weeds that are around the garden. Get out the weeds that are in the garden. But the more diversity of plants you have around, the less likely you're going to have insect problems. So my husband recently counted 41 different kinds of flowers in our garden. And some of them were weeds and some were what we planted. So that's part of paying attention to what's going on in the garden. But you can also plant what we call autumn cover crops. So that would be things like annual ryegrass, kale, oats, winter rye, winter wheat, and most of those you have to dig in again in the spring. But annual ryegrass and oats don't regrow in the spring, but they will have grown in the fall, and their roots would have helped to hold the soil so that it didn't erode. So yeah, there is a fair bit to do. If you have any unfinished compost, you could spread that over the gardens. Unfinished compost means you can still identify that that's a banana peel, that's some broccoli stem. You can still identify it. That's what I call unfinished compost. So you could spread that in the fall.
So smart to think about how you can actually continue the planting as you go into the fall season when students come back. And I love your point about the insects and plants, even just bringing that into the classroom and have students identify what's growing. Plant identification really comes into curriculum really nicely. So that's great.
Yes.
And so is there anything else that we can be doing to prepare that soil for the next growing season?
Not so much preparing the soil as having taken the time to make notes through the growing season. So when you started planting in the spring, what you planted and when you planted it, what worked and what didn't work, so that you have that record when you need it later. So that what you did and what you learned through the growing season is there for you when you're ready to get started in the spring again. So that's important. And I think it's really important for children to have an opportunity to have input into what they want recorded about their gardening experience. Because it's not necessarily just about the garden. It may be about how children worked together, how they interacted. So that's something that you can do. And to remember that every year is different. So one year you may have just the most amazing tomatoes. And the next year they weren't too bad. Oh, but the broccoli was really good. So it's really good for people to, and children especially, and young people, to know that there are forces outside of themselves, like how much rain we got and the wind and so on, that determines how well a crop does. So it's not necessarily themselves. Yeah, but also planning for crop rotation and having the Grow, Eat, Learn planning tool, I think would be really helpful for children. And the grown-ups to record things about the garden. So I was really pleased to hear about that resource. That's a good thing. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll be sharing all about some of our resources later on.
Yeah. So in the fall, you could be noting where all the different crops grew, so that the following year you can make sure that you don't plant the same thing in the same place. And we call that crop rotation. And you could have a 4-year rotation or a 6-year rotation or an 8-year rotation. It just means, moving things along so that something is different every year. And then after 8 years, you would start all over again. It's that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. But if you haven't, if you just think, oh, I'll remember where the carrots were. Well, maybe you will, maybe you won't. So I think it's a good idea in the fall to get ready for next spring to make notes of what grew where. So just as an example of a crop rotation, you could have the cucurbits. So you're wondering, what's a cucurbit?
I really am.
Yeah, so cucurbits are things like cucumbers, summer squash, winter squash, pumpkins, melons, gourds, that sort of thing.
Okay.
So that's one group.
Yep.
And then the next would be the brassicas. And the brassicas are things like broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, kale, cauliflower, kohlrabi, radishes, rutabaga, turnip. Okay, that's another block.
Mm-hmm.
The nightshades. You know, you've heard of deadly nightshades, but there were good nightshades too. So the good nightshades are things like tomatoes, pepper, eggplants, potatoes.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you're not sure which is which. Look at the flowers, because the flowers in any one group will be the same. So the shape of flowers on tomatoes is the same shape as the flowers on eggplants, as the flowers on peppers. So that's how you can find out what the families. And the fourth one is the legumes. That's the peas and beans.
Mm-hmm.
And peas and beans are so important because they can take nitrogen from the air and turn it into nitrogen in a form in the soil that plants can use. So they're really important.
So that variety becomes so important.
Yes.
Yeah. That's great. It's interesting that you talk about a lot about journaling and reflection, because I think often we think of science in the garden for students, but there's so many opportunities for them to be doing some literacy components, reading, writing in the garden, and how they can be tracking what things are happening and reflecting on what worked and what didn't. Yeah. Certainly some nice writing components there.
And drawing.
Yeah, great.
What did that insect really look like? How many legs did it have? Yes, lots to do. Yeah.
Great. And so is there anything else that you,
Hey, so
go ahead.
There's just a few questions that were just about the last topic, and I actually think they're kind of relevant. I'm wondering if I could just pose them to you, Marjorie.
Sure.
Yeah,
so
that would be great.
The two were related. One is just, you mentioned diseased plants, and one person's asking, how can you tell if it's diseased? And another about good insects versus bad insects. And then there's a third question, but I think these two are a little bit related.
Yes. So diseased plants would be something that you notice during the growing season. When something didn't grow well, it got discolored, or veins in the leaves turned yellow, or the leaves turned yellow between the veins, spots appeared on the leaves, or white mold seemed to grow on the leaves. So there were different diseases for different plants. And that's where I think the internet would be really helpful, is saying, you know, my beans have little tiny holes. What might that be? And you might find answers online. And then, oh dear, what was the second question?
Good versus bad insects, and how to tell the difference.
Oh, yeah. So, well, there was a wonderful experiment done in Nova Scotia Orchard years ago, and 95% of the insects were either beneficial or neutral, and only 5% were harmful. So remember I mentioned earlier about 41 different flowers that we had? Most insects are troublesome for maybe a couple of weeks, but most of the insects in the garden are not harmful. It's the ones that make the holes in the plant that we tend to notice. So we shouldn't be afraid to have insects in the garden. In fact, the more insects you have and the greater the variety of insects, the less likely you are to have a problem with insects. Seems kind of counterintuitive, but that's how it works. Removing, I mentioned already, removing any plant material that was infested with insects. Like if you had little worms in the peas, in the pods, then get those vines out of the garden, and remember to plant the peas someplace different next year.
Okay. Yeah. So you're really just trying to support that natural ecosystem, so that even though there's many insects and bugs in there, that they're all serving a purpose and working kind of together, or
yes, and most of them are either neutral or beneficial.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In fact, it's very gratifying when you see a fat worm, say, on your currants, and it's got little bumps inside it because another insect laid its eggs inside that worm. Mm-hmm. Very gratifying. Yes. So they keep each other in check.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. We see a lot of school food gardens that are planting things quite intentionally to draw in pollinators. So that's another way that people can be bringing in bugs into their garden.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Great. Was there another question, Satya?
There was a question about adding lime to the garden soil and whether this is a good idea.
Well, it depends where you live. So the best thing to do is to go to a garden center or wherever sells gardening supplies and get a little test kit to check the pH in your soil. It would be really nice if the pH was around 6.3, just as a, 6.3 to 6.7, sort of somewhere in there. If the number comes out lower than that, say it's 5.8, just as a for instance, that means the soil is somewhat acidic. So the lower the number is, the more acidic the soil is. That's the main thing to remember. And in that case, yes, you could add some garden lime. So garden lime is the brown stuff. The lime that you see in stores that's white is builder's lime. You don't want to use that. And so you stick to the brown garden lime. And rather than trying to add a lot of lime in one fell swoop to make a big adjustment to the pH, you're better to add a little in the spring, test again in the fall, and add a little more in the fall, and just keep testing, spring, fall, until you get the pH up to where you want it.
I remember very vividly learning about acidic and basic in chemistry classes.
Yes.
So it would be a nice way to get students in and doing some real life testing of what that pH means.
Yes, and why it's important. So why does it matter what the pH is? Mm-hmm. Well, it depends on it affects the form of the nutrients that are in the soil. So if it's too acidic, it may be that the nutrients are in a form that plants can't use. Mm-hmm. So you raise the pH, it changes the chemistry, the form of the nutrients is now available in a form that plants can use. So that's why. The other reason we add garden lime is that it can actually improve a heavy clay soil. In a clay soil, the soil particles are very, very fine. They pack close together. There's hardly any room for air. There's very little room for water to move. And so adding garden lime helps those clay particles to clump together to form bigger clumps of soil particles. And because they're bigger clumps, then there's more spaces between them for nutrients and water to move through the soil. Okay. So it's not just for nutrients, it's also for soil structure.
Great.
Yeah.
Wow. Learning something new.
Yeah.
Any other questions from the attendees, Satya, before we move on?
That was it. It just felt very topical to the conversation, so I think it made sense to do it here. So yeah.
Absolutely. That's great. Lots of really great questions. And every school food garden is going to be different. You talked about, depending on where the garden is, it's going to have a different soil and ecosystem. So it really is learning what works for you and your school and your garden, and that takes time.
Yes, it does. So I grew up on the prairies, where it's fairly dry and the soil warms up quickly in the spring. So we would never dream of mounding up the soil. We want to keep it flat to get as much water in there as possible. Here in the Maritimes, with our cold, wet springs, it's a good idea to mound up the soil, say a couple of rows where you want to plant heat lovers like tomatoes or peppers or eggplants, or just to create a slight mound of soil to grow cucumbers or zucchini or summer squash or winter squash. Because when you mound up the soil, it helps it to not be so wet, because our soils tend to be very wet in the spring. And it also helps the soil to warm up more. So can we talk about next spring?
Yeah,
okay.
Please.
So because it's really what we used to do in our garden that I'm not recommending was to dig up the soil every spring, get it all mixed up. And what we noticed is that the seeds took longer to germinate because we brought up colder soil from lower down and mixed it with the warmer soil that was on the surface. And we also found that the plants they didn't grow as fast. They didn't seem to grow quite as well. And we realized that we had disturbed the natural layering of soil. So soil normally has more organic matter up in the top, and then less as you go down. But if the pH is good in your garden, it's not too acidic, then you're likely to have lots of earthworms, and the earthworms will pull organic matter down into the soil. So what you can get are a kind of garden soil lifter. I don't know what to call it. It's kind of like a rake with giant tines, and you push it into the soil, and then you lift, you lean back, and it comes up through the soil. So it loosens the soil, but it doesn't disturb the soil profile.
And I think about 25 8-year-olds could probably do the same thing as that lifter.
Yes, with little tools.
Yeah. Well, and that sounds much easier than actually really fully turning, because I've heard that schools
that's hard work.
Yeah, that is hard work. But the little ones were probably much more likely to be able to get in there with their hands dirty and just kind of loosen up that top layer.
Yes, or those little trowels, but also those little, not so much trowels, those fork. The hand tools is like a claw.
Yep.
Those would be really good to scrape through. And also the teeny tiny little forks, because you're only going to disturb that much. So that's not like disturbing that depth, but moving that.
Just loosening that top layer. What other things can schools be thinking about first thing in the spring?
Well, if you happen to have any seeds left over, how do you tell if they're fresh enough that you can use them a second year? So I think testing germination of seeds is a good winter project. Keep their interest up. And this is the way you do it. You get a damp paper towel, not sopping wet. Maybe put it in a saucer or on a plate so that you can keep it slightly damp but not sitting in water. And spread 10 seeds from a package. And keep it warmish, like the top of, well, I guess you don't necessarily have, I was going to say on top of the fridge, but you might not have a fridge at school. But someplace warmish, but not too warm, and certainly not so warm that it dries out every day. And so if only 1 or 2 seeds germinate, well, you can still use those seeds, but you have to plant a lot of them, more than what is recommended for the usual rate. Or you might get, 7 or 8 germinating, which is kind of normal, and you could just plant those at a regular spacing. So that's something to do in the winter.
Sounds like a great science project, putting some critical analysis to work for the students.
Yes, and reviewing your notes from last year, and then writing a plan for how you're going to do the garden this year. That's more writing and more planning and thinking ahead, and how can we do that? Yeah.
Great.
Lots to do.
Lots to do. There's always lots to do in a garden.
Yeah.
Any other final tips before we go back to maybe a few questions?
Oh, make sure it's enjoyable. And sometimes it can be hard for little children to stick to a task. So make the tasks not too big, but also a little reward after. So, after we've pulled the weeds along here, then we're going to sit and we're going to do a little fun song. And then we'll do some more reading. Like, mix it up, have some fun, so that the children get a sense that gardening is a pleasure, not a chore. Because I think of how many adults who want to garden and it starts to become a chore rather than a pleasure. And to not worry if a disease takes over or an insect becomes a problem. It's, what can I learn from this to do better next time? Don't get anxious about your garden. Have fun with it.
That is just such great advice, I think, for children and adults.
Yes.
Because we know that in a school food garden, we may be able to bring some of those veggies or fruit or herbs into the school to be used in some way, but much more than just the food that's growing, it's the learning opportunities for the students. And having that lifelong love of gardening is one of them. So that's great.
Well, and learning how to cooperate with each other.
Absolutely.
When you've got lots of people, little people in a garden.
Cooperation, collaboration, and respect. Great.
Exactly.
Great. That brings us to the final question, Satya. If there's any more questions from the audience, we welcome them. We have a few minutes. Otherwise, I'll switch gears to Grow, Eat, Learn.
We have one final question, so maybe this is a good thing to do before you switch to describing a bit more about Grow, Eat, Learn. So Marjorie, the person's asking, when you plant seeds in the spring, what is the most important thing to get good germination? And they've suggested a couple of options, but maybe there are others, like, is it watering every day? Is it putting a dark cover on it to attract heat, or pre-soaking larger seeds like beans and peas? But really the key question, I think, is how to get good germination.
Okay, so fresh seed. So having done a germination test to make sure that so you don't know how many seeds to plant. But I think uneven planting depth is the biggest culprit for intermittent or incomplete germination. So one thing you can do is take the handle of, say, a rake or a hoe and lay it on the soil, move it around a little bit to create a bit of a hollow, so that the planting depth is the same all the way along. And the bigger the seed, the more likely it is that soaking it overnight would be helpful, but not essential. I have planted hard bean seeds in soil that was quite dry, and all I did was water the row of seeds after I'd planted it, and that was all the water they got, and they still managed to germinate.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's not so much soaking. The other piece is the finer the seed. So for instance, carrot seed or lettuce seed is quite fine, so you want to just sprinkle it on the surface of the soil, either in a patch or, oh, maybe we should talk about rows versus blocks another time. Maybe.
Another time.
Okay. And then I would just take up handfuls of soil and just kind of sprinkle just the barest covering, because they need light to germinate. Okay. So if you put too much soil on, they won't germinate. Mm-hmm. So that's all I have to offer.
Great, thank you. Hopefully that answers that individual's question, and I think from there we'll switch gears. So thank you, Marjorie, so much for sharing your knowledge and expertise. I know that I learned a lot today, and I hope that all the viewers did as well. We're going to switch gears a little bit here. I'm going to pull up some slides and end with a little kind of overview of what Grow, Eat, Learn is, which is why we're gathered here in celebration today. So bear with me while I share my PowerPoint slides with you. Dun, 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 dun. Okay. Satya, one thing I didn't ask was if you can still see us while I have my shared screen up.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, great. We'll still be on our best behavior then. So we really just wanted to quickly plug our new program and talk a little bit about what Grow, Eat, Learn is and the intention of it. So we really appreciate everyone joining us today to learn from Marjorie and to celebrate the launch of Grow, Eat, Learn. We've long recognized that there's some growing momentum and desire to support school food gardens around the province. And so in 2016, Nourish, where I work, partnered with Ecology Action Centre, where Satya works, to start the development of a school food garden program which became Grow, Eat, Learn. We've worked with stakeholders and garden leaders around the province. This has been done very intentionally and co-developed with many folks, including a really robust advisory committee. And so we're really excited to bring this to life in some way today. We're by no means finished, we're just getting started. And so what you will see through some website navigation is the launch of our guiding practices, which we see as the cornerstone for Grow, Eat, Learn. And these are really adaptable guidelines that schools can be using to help guide their planning to help schools integrate their garden into their school setting. So that's where what we're launching today is some of those supporting resources and our guiding practices, but we're continuing to seek partnerships and funding opportunities to be able to provide some really robust on-the-ground support for school food garden leads. We're hearing that they're all facing common challenges. Summer maintenance is one that we hear often, funding, staff time, and so we want to be able to provide those types of knowledge and expertise to support them in the best way we can. So the guiding practices, which I mentioned, is kind of the foundational document of Grow, Eat, Learn. And this has 7 pillars to this document. It's available for download free on our website, which I'll very quickly show you here in a minute. There's 7 guiding practices, and each are really a different foundational piece to how you can pull the garden into your school community. Not that everything has to be done at once, but it's a great thing when you're doing some kind of physical garden planning to think about what guiding practice you may like to focus on this year. So maybe it's having students really connect with nature, appreciate their local ecosystems and how to garden in a safe way for the world and their planet, or it could be a way of, reflecting on the physical safety needs of your garden. Each guiding practice is different and all valuable, and so something that you can work towards over time. And so our accompanying resources support each of those. So our website launched last week, as I mentioned, nourishns.ca/groweatlearn. I'm just going to very quickly pull up a few things so that I can point out some tips and tools on how to navigate throughout the website. See if this opens. Oh, I've already got it launched here. Hopefully you can still see that. So if you go to nourishns.ca/groweatlearn, that's where you'll find us. It's also housed under the program section on the main navigation bar. So this will land you to our main page, which you can explore in your own time in the future. We do have some really nice introductory videos around what the guiding practices are, so you would be able to play one of those right here on the right-hand side. And then from there, there's jump-offs to each of the different guiding practices. If you wanted to download the physical copy of the guiding practice, that's available right here. I have one with me today. So this is a 20-page document that we created that gives an overview of each guiding practice and some kind of tips and tools, stories from the garden to get you started. But the PDF does not include all of the robust resources that come alongside of it. So it's a nice thing to have side and side, the print and the website. I will say that we designed the guiding practice document to work really nicely as binder tabs. So you can be printing off that resource, sliding each guiding practice into a binder protector, and then collecting your own resources over time to support each of those guiding practices. So you'd be able to download that, pressing that blue button there. And I'll very quickly show you the Plan, Evaluate, and Share page. So like I mentioned, this is one of our guiding practices, a little bit of an introductory to what this is, but you'll see the full extensive kind of outline within the print document. There's a video here that you can watch to understand what Plan, Evaluate, and Share is, how you may be able to pull it into the classroom. And then we have resources that support this.
Kayla, I don't think we can see that part of the website. Are you on it?
Yes, I am.
So I just see this, I still see your slide, not your website.
Oh, shoot. Okay. Let me try again. So do you see me now?
I see you now.
Okay.
And if you try share screen again.
Okay.
Yes. Perfect. Thank you.
Now you do? Okay. Did you see any of the website, or was it just the...
No.
No. Okay. So I'll pull us up to the top again here and go really quick. So Grow, Eat, Learn is in our primary navigation. This is the main page. You can watch the introductory video here. The link offs to all of the different guiding practices are found there on the left-hand side. And then on the right is the button where you can download the PDF for the Grow, Eat, Learn guiding practices. Sharing our story portal, that sort of thing. So I'll take you to plan, evaluate, and share. Is that popping up there now?
Yep.
Great. So each guiding practice has its standalone page that gives a little explanation of what it is. You'll see the full details in the PDF. There's also a video to watch. This video gives another outline. It's about 1.5 to 2 minutes. Every guiding practice will have a standalone page and a standalone video. And so these are the resources that you're not going to see in the print version. And we've had them online because we know these are going to evolve over time. The planning and evaluation worksheets is what Marjorie referred to during her conversation. Really helps you reflect and plan on what you want your garden to be in the coming year and how you may be able to pull your guiding practices into that. But there's everything from how to plan for fundraising, some steps to classroom gardens, that sort of thing. So these are all live links. Some of them are made in-house here at Nourish. Many others are external links to some great resources that we've found online. This is just the start of them. If you wanted to see the full extensive list, you would be able to press See All. And so each guiding practice will have unique resources to support you in working towards them. We have a little curriculum connection, story from the field, and then you would be able to jump around to the other guiding practices. So that's a very quick overview of our website launch, and really encourage you to take some time over the next week or so as you wrap up and plan for next year to think about how you may be able to pull your guiding practices in. So I'm just going to quickly pull up my slides here one more time so that you're able to see some of our social media and how to stay connected with us.
And Kayla, let me know when you want to launch the second poll.
Yes, we will do that in 2 shakes. I love this image because it's just a maze of all the way that curriculum and learning can happen in the garden. So many of which Marjorie already highlighted today.
Oh, and the math one too.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. So many options. So hopefully this has been enough to spark your interest and stay connected with Grow, Eat, Learn. There's many ways that you can do so. Of course, we have our website, which I just showed you. We're also available on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. So if you're tweeting about your school food garden or other gardens that you're involved in, you can use the hashtag #SeeWhatI'mGrowing. We often keep track of the awesome things that are happening around the province that way. And I also asked earlier about being part of the Nourish Nova Scotia School Food Garden Network. This is a closed group on Facebook that we encourage you to search and ask for an invite to. It's a really nice forum for garden leaders like yourself around the province to be asking questions, posting interesting articles, and we hope to have this continue to grow over time. So these are some ways that you can stay connected with us online. On our website, we also have a newsletter sign up. So we do have a newsletter specific to school food gardens where we send out helpful tips like some of the things you may have heard from Marjorie today. So that's another way to stay connected and learn about Grow, Eat, Learn as we continue to grow. And the last thing I'll plug is that we do have another webinar coming up in a few weeks, joined by another special guest, Erica Phillips. Erica is a vice principal at a school here in Halifax and has a really beautiful, thriving school food garden. And she's going to be talking about how you can get your students and community involved in your school food garden. So we really encourage you to join us for that as well. There will be a registration link here, but we'll make sure to have that circulated to the group after. And so, Satya, maybe you want to post those final questions as we wrap up here.
Great. So people should see the polls in their screen if you want to respond there. And it usually takes a few moments for folks. There's just 2 questions for folks to respond. And we'll see what they say.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? You know, different parts of the province. And let's see, after hearing.
Oh, there's one person's responded. So if you can't find it, I think the poll should just pop up in the bottom there. It should bounce or have a little red symbol if you are having trouble finding it. And I'll leave that open for a few minutes maybe while we just wrap up, and I'll share the results in a second.
And we really appreciate feedback. If you download the guiding practices and start to use it within your own class or school, we'd love to hear how that goes. This is something that we've been working at for a long time, but is also new in terms of testing with schools. So we're really eager to see how it works, and of course we'll be developing and rolling out new resources over time to hopefully meet the needs of those school food gardens. And then in the future you should hear all about our funding success and our ability to have some on-the-ground support. So we're going to be working really hard at that.
Ooh,
Oh, great.
So interesting.
Yeah.
So lots of people are going to be registering for the next webinar, which is great to hear, and we hope to continue these types of facilitated conversations. But looks like a good smattering of checking out the website, talking to their garden committees, so that's all great.
Oh, it's exciting.
Oh, and lots of people eager to talk more about learning in the garden, which is all about connecting with curriculum, which is certainly one of the really important pieces of a garden's potential. Great.
And just to pass on, we're getting a few notes of thanks from people, both on the chat and the Q&A, so that's really great to know as well.
That is. And we're just 2 minutes over 4, so I think we can wrap it up from here. Really appreciate Marjorie joining us and sharing everything. Always great to hear your voice and to finally meet you in person. I've been a long time listener. We really appreciate everyone joining us today, and all the best with your school food gardens. We know that they're a great site of learning for students around the province, and we just can't wait to see how we can all continue to grow together. Thanks, Satya, for being our facilitator and tech guru.
On the fly tech support, no problem. It was really good. I always learn stuff too, so I'm really happy and excited.
Hard not to be excited about gardens.
Exactly.
Great. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Have a great Thursday and happy growing.
Okay.